Wie soll man Skulpturen aufnehmen? How should one photograph sculptures? It's been 125 years since Heinrich Wölfflin posed that question in a series of 3 articles, and we're still figuring it out. Wölfflin was confident that he had the answer. The essays were actually entitled Wie man Skulpturen aufnehmen soll, how one should photograph sculptures. Working with the relatively new medium of photographic reproductions in slides and printed books, a cumbersome and costly process at the turn of the 20th century, one needed to crystallize a 3-dimensional object into the clearest, most representative form in a single image. There were, Wölfflin insisted, richtige and unrichtige perspectives, and you had to find the one that showed the work in its most elegant, stable, and complete composition. One needed a disciplined art historical eye to find them. Medievalists were quick to exploit the new reproductive tools. In monumental catalogs by Richard Hamann, Arthur Kingsley Porter, and others, these 2 volumes from the early 1920s, photographs pinned down sculptures that the authors had journeyed far and wide to see, arranging them to form narratives of stylistic developments in regional tastes. This documentary mode of photography, which we find also in Willibald Sauerlander's classic Gothic sculpture in France of 1970, also allowed iconographic programs and motifs to be clearly distinguished, to be read across pages, encouraging, in a very literal sense, the understanding of the Gothic portal as a sermon in stone or book of the unlettered. Now, these kinds of documentary photos were and remain indispensable tools for anyone wishing to learn about the formatting, style, and iconography of sculptural arts. We need them to get a handle on the basics of what we're studying. But the technology that's developed in our, or at least Kate's and my lifetime, has changed the way we look at, study, teach, and think about sculpture in really profound ways. It's not just that camera technology allows us to shed our reliance on the 24 or 36 shot roll of film, which really did, at least if you were on a budget, press you to capture only die richtige Aufnahmen, the perfect shots, and more often to turn back to the existing archive. But also, the rise of PowerPoint and other presentation platforms have allowed us to move beyond the old 2-slide format to bring 3rd and 4th images into the picture that complicate binary analyses, or to zoom in or out of a single view. While we're here, let me just say a word of praise for the new morph transition function on PowerPoint, which creates a cinematic smoothness to sequences of details, as you're seeing in this photograph of the conch tympanum, which I took last May. This is one actually productive use of AI technology. Now, while there was plenty of interest in phenomenological questions among European art historians of the early 20th century, and while the flourishing of reader response theory in Europe and the US in the 1980s and early 90s turned many art historians toward questions of how works of art look and have an impact on beholders standing in front of them, I'd venture to say that the various turns that our field has taken since the early 2000s, phenomenological, material, affective turns, are inextricable from the new technological modes through which we perceive our objects of study. I know for me, being able to go to Gothic sites and photograph from various angles in different lighting conditions and in various states of proximity sharpens my gaze and helps me see new things. It makes me aware of my physical standpoint and relative ease of access, which in turn prompts me to think about the perspective and access of people in the past. Who is expected to see this angle, and under what historical, political, liturgical conditions? There's something filmic about making sequences of still images on site, and certainly in presenting them this way in scholarly conferences or the classroom. Here's a screenshot of my sort of move around of Uta and Ekkehard at Naumburg Cathedral that you're seeing me looking towards on the right-hand side of the screen in this image. I got my first digital camera in 2005 at the urging of my former advisor, Stephen Murray, and I used it on a funny road trip that I made that summer with Rob Bork and Achim Timmermann. The camera was a bigger version of this little one. It had a flip-out screen, and it seemed very high-tech at the time. As both the technology and my own skills improved, most recently with this good digital SLR camera, this is a Nikon D7000 that I use all the time now, I've been continuing to make all of my own pictures on site. Although it is heavy to drag around, this camera is really what has led to some of my best pictures. It's really important for me to have something hefty to kind of hold up to my face and really record what it is that I am seeing at different standpoints. So I like to always use this first and foremost to think through the works that I'm standing in front of. But I'll admit that over the years, my cell phone has become increasingly important, especially for shooting architecture in low light, capturing images in museums or from odd angles, and most of all, making use of the video function. I use this function largely to make visual notes to myself, to fix certain fleeting visual impressions that I know I want to write about, in some cases where I need to remember my exact physical standpoint and the visual relations among an image's parts. Here's a case where I needed to record the compositions that emerge in the side compartments of this Netherlandish altarpiece in Rouen when you stand at a central point in front of the altar and take these oblique views. And I wanted to see also what some of the sculptures looked like, from that lowered point of view, as well as for my own personal research needs. For example, if I want to emphasize the sense of scale and the time that it takes to look at things. We see that in this little walk that I'm doing across the south transept of Strasbourg Cathedral. One of the big limitations of video or films in the study of sculpture is that they're so purposeful. They reproduce one's encounters with artworks very beautifully, but they're so bound to the body and the eyes and the mechanics of the filmmaker. You're only going to see what that person is looking at. I love to see works of art this way, in moving images and in 3 dimensions. But for scholarly purposes, I really find watching other people's videos of sculpture or architecture frustrating. They remind me of how much I'm not seeing and make me want to be there and find my own paths. Now, the forms of digital 3D modeling that we currently have on various websites would seem to free us from the limits of film and the stillness of photography, as you can see in this set of views available through the Musée de Cluny of the Adam from the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Once the model is published online, we have the agency to see the work from every possible angle and degree of proximity. While this mode has its advantages, it also has problems, for it ignores the site specificity of the sculpture, its weight and mass, something that comes out, I think, more effectively when you see a sequence of images of the figure from a grounded standpoint in the space. Now, my own work over the past decade, culminating in my book, Eloquent Bodies, has engaged intensely with the question, wie soll man Skulpturen aufnehmen? How to capture the spatial effects of Gothic sculpture in a pictorial medium. Figural sculptures of the 13th and 14th centuries, such as the Wilhelm at Naumburg, were strongly mimetic in their bodily configurations and volumes, but not completely spatially fluid like the works of Bernini. They were multifaceted, with distinct compositions made for each face of the angled plinth on which they stand, sometimes round plinths as well. My approach in rendering this quality visually has been to create montages of these facets and offer them to viewers as a set. On the printed page, these kinds of montages might take on the appearance of film strips, but they're more effective in the live lecture format in which I develop my analyses. View from the center and strip away the background. Seen sequentially in time, the figures can emerge as a composite of these facets, with the viewer's mind filling in the transitional perspectives. This kind of presentation allows the multiplicity of views to come forth in a controlled way, according to how the work is physically encountered in real space. We see this again in this lovely lad from the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. We can linger over these discrete compositions, seeing each view as die richtige from its own perspective, with the figure as a whole being a consolidation of these varied parts. A pluribus unum Gothic style.